There are things I can't force. I must adjust. There are times when the greatest change needed is a change of viewpoint.
Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge a content warning about my talk. As you can see, my talk discusses themes of suicide, homophobia, homophobic slurs, and repeatedly uses the word queer in a reclaimed sense. If any of these things are uncomfortable or triggering for you, I advise you to click away from the video for a moment. Thanks. Every queer person has a story of the first time they saw another queer person. The light bulb moment, a flash of recognition, something that lay dormant in themselves that they see active in another. For me, it was season 2, episode 4 of Fox's hit teen drama, Glee. The series follows a group of misfit teens performing in a show choir at their mainly conservative high school. The episode in question centers around 2 cheerleaders, Brittany and Santana, kissing for the very first time. I'll never forget the moment that I saw that kiss. I remember thinking to myself, wait a minute, 2 girls are allowed to kiss? It was something I never even thought of before. But the more that I did think about it, the more that I realized it was something I kind of wanted to do. Before I ever heard the word lesbian or even sexuality, that kiss remained present in my mind. And it was that kiss that launched my journey into self-identity and discovery that would last throughout my entire adolescence. The theme of this year's convention is the new age of enlightenment, and I believe no one represents that theme better than my generation, Generation Z. Gen Z babies were born anywhere from 1996 to 2012, and despite our young age, we have already made our mark on this world. Climate change activism, the Black Lives Matter movement, anti-gun violence protests, these are all things that my generation has taken an active part in participating in. Fun fact about Gen Z, we are actually the queerest generation to exist thus far. According to a 2017 study by Ipsos Mori, 66% of Gen Zers identify as strictly heterosexual, in comparison to 71% of millennials and 85% of Gen Z. But why is this? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why queer representation, specifically on screen, matters so much to me. And regardless of your identity, it should matter just as much to you. Now, in order to have an educated conversation about queer representation on screen, we first need to get a baseline level of knowledge about how queer people have been treated by the film industry. And to do that, we need to look to the past and begin by taking a look at the golden age of Hollywood, which lasted from the early 1930s until the late 1960s. The pinnacle of the film industry during this era was something known as the studio system. Wealthy producers created studios such as MGM, 20th Century Fox, and others, each of which had their own company of actors, writers, directors, and designers, all contracted under these specific studios to make movies. The studio system ensured that these creatives were given fair, livable wages, but it often meant that they had to sacrifice creative control over their projects. Together, the heads of these studios created a strict set of moral guidelines any film produced under the studio system had to follow in order to be given a wide release. The set of rules was known as the Hays Code. 1, no picture shall lower the moral standards of those who view it. Hence, the sympathies of the audience shall not be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. 2, correct standards of life, subject to the requirements of drama and entertainment, shall be presented. And 3, law, human and natural, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. The Hays Code put a prohibition on any studio system-produced film of nudity, suggestive dancing, superfluous use of liquor, miscegenation, ridicule of religion, lustful kissing, scenes of passion, and of course, discussions of sexual perversity, aka homosexuality. These guidelines put into place a system in which no queer character could be existing on a screen in a studio system-produced film unless they were in some way punished for their queer identity. Imagine being a queer person during this era, going to see a movie, seeing a character on screen that for some reason or another reminds you a little bit of yourself, watching that character be brutally defeated, the protagonist celebrating that their evil has been vanquished. That sends the message to that queer audience member that not only is their queerness something that they should be ashamed of, but it's something that they deserve to be punished for. Now imagine every single movie you see with a character that reminds you a little bit of yourself ends the exact same way. This is what the Hays Code did to its queer audience members. In a time in which queer people were already being isolated, mocked, and even killed for their queerness, they couldn't even find the solace of seeing a movie. The studio system died in the late 1960s and the Hays Code along with it. However, the set of ideals that made something like the Hays Code possible in the first place still remained very much ingrained into American culture, arguably until the late 1990s. That's when things began to take a turn for the better. In 1998, the history of queer characters on screen would forever be changed by the success of NBC's hit sitcom, Will and Grace. The series followed two best friends, a gay man and a straight woman, living in New York City, navigating love, life, friendship, and career. It was a massive hit, running for 7 seasons and even garnering a revival in 2017. Will and Grace was so important because it was the first time a mainstream sitcom showcased a queer main character in a positive light. Will, the character in question, was a gay man, but he was also a successful lawyer. He was rich, intelligent, well-spoken. He was masculine and defied many of the harmful stereotypes that existed about gay men at the time. And his actor, Eric McCormick, quickly became the household crush of men, women, and people of all different genders all across the country. Will and Grace was so important for queer audiences because it showed for the first time that queer life was more than just sadness and death. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just queer audiences who were affected by it. According to a study conducted by Edward Schiappa of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 71% of Will and Grace viewers he interviewed believed homosexual relationships to be just as normal as heterosexual ones. And that's in comparison to 45% of those who believed the same thing who did not watch the show. I'm not trying to say that this one TV show caused an entire generation of people to become less homophobic, but I do think that Will and Grace is an incredibly important piece of media that showcased a time in which queer issues were finally coming to the forefront of public knowledge. When we look back on Will and Grace from a modern perspective, it's certainly not perfect, and there are absolutely aspects of it that are outdated. But it arguably did more than any other piece of media of its time to further queer representation on screen. So now you know a couple of examples of what queer representation has looked like in the past. But in order to fully understand why this topic is so important, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about my journey to get here, why I decided to start speaking on this topic in the first place. I grew up in Southern California in an area called Orange County, and I was just like any other kid. I liked to go to the mall, hang out with my friends, eat pizza, read good books, but I always knew that there was something different about me. I could never quite put my finger on it, but I just knew that there was something that set me apart from the rest of my friends. I felt disgusting when I had to kiss a boy in the school play. My heart skipped a beat every time my female best friend held my hand. When the boy I had a crush on asked me out, I completely panicked and stopped talking to him altogether. And when I watched season 2, episode 4 of Glee, everything began to fall into place. Now, you would think of California as a generally accepting, open, diverse place, and it is for the most part. Nobody cares who you're kissing in San Diego or LA, but in Orange County, one of the state's few historically conservative districts, things are different. They were nice people, but I wasn't anything like them. Shortly after I came out, one of my classmates approached me after gym and told me that I needed to start changing in the bathroom because it made her and the rest of our female classmates uncomfortable to be sharing a locker room with a dyke. I was the only out queer woman I knew, and I felt completely and horribly alone. So I did what most lonely teenagers do. I went on the internet. My Google search history was filled with best lesbian movies, TV shows with lesbian characters, best fictional lesbian couples, and on one particularly frustrating day, oh my God, why aren't there any lesbian rom-coms as good as the ones made for straight people? I devoured every piece of queer media I could get my hands on. When life was tough, the fictional lesbians of Orange is the New Black, Imagine Me and You, But I'm a Cheerleader, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer were there for me. And they were enough to get me through, at least for a while. But my loneliness always persisted long after the end credits. Along with a few other mental health issues I was struggling with at the time, that loneliness eventually became so overpowering that in the spring of 2016, I attempted to end my life. I'm still here, as you can see, and my mental health has only gotten better since then. But I got lucky. I had a family that supported me when I came out, who had the financial means to pay for my mental health treatment, and who have always strived to give me the best opportunities and support system that they possibly could. Not every queer kid has those things. And it's a sad fact that suicide rates amongst queer youth are becoming dangerously high. As of 2018, the CDC reports that 15 to 34% of queer students have attempted suicide at least once in their young lives. That's in comparison to the 3 to 9% suicide rate of their cisgender heterosexual peers. My attempt to take my own life was indicative of how I felt as a queer person existing in a straight world, completely alone. And the pieces of queer media that I often relied on to help me feel less alone weren't always quite right. The movies and TV shows that empowered my queer identity were few and far between. Most were hard to access, painted a negative stereotype about my identity, or were just plain bad. The pieces of media that showed me that my queerness was something to celebrate helped keep me alive during some of the darkest points of my life. And the ones that told me it was something to be ashamed of worsened my pain. Not all queer media is created equal, but there are ways we can assess it. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, was founded in 1985, and since its origins has strived to create a world with impactful, empowering queer media. One of the ways that they do this is through the publication of their annual Studio Responsibility Index, a set of modules and data that showcases every instance of a queer character in a mainstream film each year. According to the 2020 Studio Responsibility Index, the amount of queer characters present in these films went up by 0.4%, which is amazing. Unfortunately, it's not all perfect. More than half of actors present had less than 3 minutes of screen time each. Bechdel test. It's a series of questions composed meant to assess how well any given movie or TV show treats its female characters, named after their co-founder, Vito Russo. To pass the Vito Russo test, a film or TV show must have 3 big requirements. 1, it must contain an identifiably queer character. 2, that character must not be solely identified by their queer sexuality or gender identity. And 3, that character must be tied to the plot in such a way that their removal would cause a significant effect. With these 3 simple rules, The average consumer has the ability to assess what any given piece of media thinks about its queer audience members. And as a young queer audience member, having a tool like that is an incredibly empowering thing. Growing up queer was not easy for me. I had a family that accepted me, yes. My friends and peers did not. And honestly, I didn't always accept myself. More often than not, queer people have been portrayed on screen as evil, immoral people who deserve to be punished for their queer identities. Generations of queer people have had to watch their identities mocked on screen for the purposes of entertainment. And until today, the media that society has praised has encouraged us to stay in the closet. The media of today paints a more brighter picture, however. It tells its queer audiences that their queerness is not something to run away from, but something to celebrate. And it sends the messages to all of its audience members that their identity is something that they should be proud of, no matter what it may be. If what I had to say to you today has at all sparked your imagination, I have a challenge for you. Think critically about the media that you consume, how it treats its queer people, and specifically about what kind of relationship it's fostering between the queer and cisgender/heterosexual communities. Be an active consumer. You don't have to pick something apart to the point of no longer enjoying it, but be aware of what messages the media you consume is trying to tell you. Because at least for me, those messages hold an incredible amount of power. Queer representation saved me. And if we think critically about the media that we have access to, maybe it can save someone else. Thank you. Mental health resources for anyone who might need it. Thanks.